Willkommen in einem anderen Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 9 of my Große Schlachten, formerly a Napoleonic War, series of example games, covering my latest failure and the lessons I've learnt from this horrible disaster. This is yet another failed commander video, second actually, which are beginning to be rather common these days. I may need to go back to commander basic school, as perhaps I'm missing something. Anyway, enough of my whining, let's move on to the epic tale of this latest failure. Let's first quickly go over the rules. I'm using a set of rules which is called Große Schlachten, or Big Battles rules. This is a figure gaming set of rules based on the SBI board games called Napoleonic War, which was first published in the 1970s, or mid-1970s. Those interested in this can find the links at the end of the video or in the comments section. The Napoleonic War game system is so simple I will not be covering any rules and mechanics in this video. Viewers should be able to pick up what is occurring easily, as this is not an in-depth analysis of the rules or the nitty-gritty aspects of the game, more as a general tale of failure. Let's first set the scene. It's 1814 and times are rather grim for the French. While most of the spotlight is on the Emperor as he fends off the Allied armies, down south the British and their Portuguese and Spanish allies are driving deep into wholly French territory. As the commander of the French forces facing Wellington, I was ordered to stop this perfidious Englishman and drive him back off the holy soil of France. In order to stop the evil British forces, I decided to attack or launch an attack before the full Spanish forces could join up with Wellington. But I failed and instead found myself facing a British attack which occurred before I could assemble all my forces together. The gods were certainly not on my side, but I knew I could in theory match the British in terms of total strength, so I prepared to meet them. Exactly uncertain of where the British would advance, I placed a militia corps on the left flank and two strong corps in the centre and right flanks. Unfortunately for me, I was attempting to cover a far too wide front line, as the front line in this area was 24 kilometres. Unfortunately for me, my cavalry was scheduled to arrive at midday, so I could not screen my front line flanks, and as a result I couldn't form a compact formation, or at least that was my original thought. I decided instead, quite foolishly, to cover everything with my infantry. This shows my valiant troops on my right flank. The river and woods gave them a very strong position to hold. When the British finally did arrive, I could see that they were aiming for my centre and my left flank. The British were also in a much more concentrated formation. I should also note that while the British had effectively 4 corps, they were all smaller than any of my individual 3 corps. So in terms of overall strength, in theory, the British really only slightly outnumbered me. Anyway, back to the battle. The British objective were the 3 main towns on the central line of advance, which are marked with the red dots, as well as a town on the British left flank, which is my right flank. If the British could take these 4 towns, my position would become hopeless, and I would be forced to withdraw deeper into the holy French territories. For the honour of France, I had to hold these vital locations. The British hit my militia corps formation in the morning, and while my militia were fortified and in a good defensive position, the strength of the British advance blew them away. After 2 hours of fighting, the militia corps was broken, and the few pitiful survivors streamed back towards my central position, with a small force driving towards my far left position. Here you can see the British were about to smack into my militia, which unfortunately had to use captured Prussian uniforms. Just a quick note, my French forces were actually Prussian figures, because with this particular basing scheme, my opponent, who provided the figures, didn't have any French. I find this completely unacceptable that a 15mm figure gaming or Napoleonic figure gaming player should not at least have 1 French army. Anyway, let's move on with the battle. This shows the British regular troops, specifically their light corps and a regular corps, hitting my militia. The militia crumbled in about 1 to 2 hours of heavy fighting, and with heavy losses as well. Seeing my entire left flank crumbling away, I desperately attempted to bring back forces from my right flank to secure the left. But alas, they were far too far away, and my commander had difficulty commanding them correctly. I only managed to get them into the central position before the British arrived, which secured that, or at least initially, but the left flank was lost for good. In the centre, my regular line infantry managed to hold as they held a very strong defensive position, but with the left flank gone, they were very vulnerable. This shows the vicious fighting which occurred in the centre of my front line, where my regular troops managed to hold. The cardboard counters that you see there represent fortifications, so the troops that the British were hitting initially were heavily fortified. However, while easily resisting the initial British attack, as more and more British arrived, the pressure in the centre was becoming a more serious concern to me. But the centre did continue to hold, but only after the loss of one of my brave generals, as he desperately led a ferocious counterattack to hold the position. On the left flank, most of the militia had dissolved, leaving only the artillery, which did put up a valiant defence. At great risk to himself, the commander of my militia led the defences from his gun positions, as you can see here. On the right flank, the British were beginning to prepare for crossing the river. At the same time, many troops from my right flank were streaming back to the centre in an attempt to save the central objective. As those troops were leaving, the British position became more and more viable, or the British found it more and more viable to consider an attack across the river into my remaining heavily fortified troops. The Centre Corps managed or desperately attempted to hold and did reasonably succeed, but at midday the central town had been taken as the British had managed to outflank them. The collapse of my left flank and my heavy losses were beginning to affect the morale of all my troops by about 1300 hours. Demoralised, my troops no longer would follow orders to attack unless I personally led the charge myself. On the far left flank, a small intact force of militia were holding out, but then they were hit in the flank by a small British detachment, knocking them out of the battle for good. Fighting over the central objective was insanely intense, but after a lucky charge by the British, which caused the brave defenders to fall back, the objective was finally lost just after midday. At midday, my light cavalry had finally arrived, but now all they could do was to cover my withdrawal. It was another disastrous defeat for the French, and luckily for me, Napoleon was soon on his way to a prison on Elba, so I could not be punished for this disaster. Phew! With the loss of the central objective, the British continued to drive forward slowly. You can see a small militia detachment in the distance, which was being hit in the flank and soon was to be forced off the playing area. Once the key central objective had been taken and half of my right flank forces had been pulled back to try and retake the objective, the British finally launched their final attack across the river, pitting my finally uncommitted corps. They managed to gain a foothold in the woods on the French side, as you can see here. The battle had become a seething mass of men, hell on earth, or at least for the 15mm metal figures. Luckily, metal figures don't seem to worry too much when it gets a bit warm, as long as the temperature is below the melting point of lead, and it remained at that point, but nonetheless it was intense. Demoralised, and after having taken heavy casualties, it was time to withdraw. By 1300, the battle was effectively over. In 7 hours, the British had broken the last defenders facing them, and now the road further into holy territory of France was open to the perfidious British forces under the evil Wellington. Let's now look at the analysis of the battle and what error I made. The error I made was actually rather simple in retrospect. I spread my forces out too much and allowed the British to destroy one of my 3 corps with minimal effort. After that, it was all really downhill. The reason why I adopted this rather crazy deployment, it was rather complex, but this was the first time that I used a new basing size, where the elements were 3 cm wide. Prior to this, I used figures in a 5 cm wide tray. By reducing a base size down to 3 cm wide, I was almost doubling the width of the playing area. With such a large playing area, I initially decided to hold the whole front line, which was foolish. In retrospect, I should have kept my army in a more compact form, covering the central objective only. It would be highly unlikely the British would focus on my right flank, as the stream, woods and fortification would have made that too difficult to break. A central thrust would have certainly been more reasonable, and while the British may well have pushed me back, once again fortifications and urban fighting would have made this very difficult to guarantee victory for the British. An attack against my left flank, which is the location of my weakest corps, the militia corps, basically the militia or the citizens of the town of Toulouse, would have been the best option, but in this case my militia would have been much more concentrated in fortification and with support close by. Also, the British would have taken longer to get there, thus wasting time. This was still the best strategy for the British, I suspect, and would have pushed my forces back. But I suspect with the heavy losses I incurred, or without the heavy losses I incurred in the actual battle, and I think that even if the British had taken this strategy, it would have been a very ferocious and difficult fight for the central objective town. So as a result, I think this strategy would have been the best overall strategy. If the British took the objective by the end of the day, they would just win. Not a substantial or decisive victory, but they would certainly win. If they could not take the objective, then they would suffer basically a marginal loss. This actually ended up, or normally ends up, being the normal battle result when I use these rules with the ad hoc scenario card generation system and neither side stuffs up their deployment or their battle plans. The scenario I gamed here was an ad hoc card-based scenario generation system using the force mixes based on the Battle of Toulouse in 1814. The game system is designed to deploy, or for both people to have available, 12 element-sized corps, which gives you a total force mix of about 90,000 men each in a typical game, which is much larger than the actual Battle of Toulouse. As a result, the force mixes are based on upscaling the divisions to corps-size formations. This is why the French has an entire militia corps in the card deck. This actually represents the reserve division scaled up to a corps size. The card system is designed to give players a totally unique situation which resembles an actual military situation that you may have read in history, a real battle. Instead of using army lists, the force mix cards are based on the actual battles themselves, or a actual battle. So players get something which resembles reality, at least to an extent. In addition to force mix cards, both players also pull random cards. The French player randomly pulled a fortification card on the left here, which allows up to 12 elements to be fortified. So that was a good card for me at the cost of 2 VPs. And I also pulled a superior reconnaissance card, which allows the French player to detect if the British were attempting some wild outflanking manoeuvre, which they ended up not doing so. But it's still good to know that I'm not going to be expecting British forces to suddenly appear on my flank. On the British side, the British player pulled a specific objective card, which allows the British to gain 9 VPs if they take this special objective, which in this case was on the British right flank. And they also pulled a double 1 force mix card, which allows the British to take any force mix card that they've already pulled and double it. The British player selected 3 force mix cards, or 3 divisions, and one of them was doubled in strength. They all arrive on game turn 1, so the cost of this force is 42 points. The later these forces arrive, the lesser the points, because they're on the playing area for a lesser period of time. Because they arrive on game turn 1, the Q1 points value is used for each card. The British player also randomly selected a cavalry division and a Portuguese division, and decided that they would arrive in the 4th quarter, which is game turn 10. They did this because that's the only way to fit within the 48-point limit of the game. On the French side, the French started with 3 divisions, which has a total of 40 points. Once again, they all arrive game turn 1. The values are the Q1 values. I must admit, when I pulled these cards and deployed it, I was hoping that I would be attacking rather than the British. But because the British actually had more on game turn 1, they became the attackers, which completely foiled my original strategy, but at least allowed me to use the fortification card. The French player also pulled a cavalry division, and this arrives on the third quarter or game turn 7. This has a cost of 8 points if it arrives in Q3 or game turn 7, and that gave me a total of 48 points. The result of this random card selection is that every scenario looks very much like an actual battle situation, but a situation that no one had ever been able to, that had never faced before, thus they couldn't test or play test the scenario, and it's basically sprung on the player at the eve of the battle, so no prior preparation could be undertaken. Look, historical scenarios work very well, but the one issue I find with historical scenarios are that the person creating the scenario clearly knows the scenario better than anyone else playing, and if two people play a scenario which they haven't created, if one decides to study it up beforehand, they will almost certainly do a better job than the one that doesn't basically study the day before. This is not inherently a bad thing, but it's something that you need to consider. And so we come to an end of my part 9 of my Große Schlachten, formerly the Napoleonic War, series of videos, in this case covering my latest disaster and the lessons I learned from this disaster. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.